All right, turn to your neighbor and tell them your favorite sandwich. What's your favorite sandwich? Egg meal. It's a classic. It's a safe choice. It's a safe choice, unless it's a garage one. You don't want to buy a garage. You don't want to buy a garage egg meal sandwich. Yeah. It's like prawns, isn't it? Yeah. All right, shout at me. I've got an egg meal sandwich over here. Egg and onion. What have we got from over here? Favorite sandwich? Prawn and mayonnaise. Good choices. Good choices. Cheese and ham. Coronation chicken. Oh, we're getting fancy over here. Pastrami with horseradish and salad. Meatball sub. Oh, hitting into Joey territory here if we have our first slide up. Does anybody know Friends? Joey is sandwich mad, and Friends, I think, is a meatball sub that he has. My favourite sandwich is between, I love a club sandwich. Can't go wrong with the filling bread. It's a good sandwich. And the drift roll. Hello. Yeah. Hello. They now do gluten-free for any gluten-free people. They do a gluten-free drift roll. Anyway, sandwiches have some bearing on our passage today. Little bearing, but some bearing. In that, today's passage is actually called a Markan sandwich. That is what theologians have known our passage today as a Markan sandwich. So hence my tedious tie there. So we have two stories today sandwiched together. We have, first of all, Jairus and his dying daughter is the first slice of bread. The lady with the issue of blood comes in the middle, and then it's finished off again with Jairus' daughter being healed from the dead, being raised from the dead. So Tom Wright says about this, if we have the next slide, what Mark has done is to place one tale inside the other in what is sometimes called a Markan sandwich. See, a theologian said it. I'm not making it up. The flavour of the outer story adds zest, adds zest to the inner one. The taste of the inner one is meant in turn to permeate the outer one. So I wanted initially to only focus on one of these stories, and the more I read about it, I realised, well, you can't deconstruct some sandwiches. Some sandwiches are meant to go together. So this is now a sandwich that's coming to us in one piece. I'm going to change the way that we're going through this passage this morning. This probably isn't going to be a typical message for me in the style that we're going to go through, because I really want us to tell the story of what happened. I want us to feel the story of what happened. And I want, as we go through this story, to actually put yourself there, because this story has a lot of depth and a lot of feeling. And the theologians that I was reading, they were all urging the readers to put yourself there, imagine yourself as one of the people in the crowd. And so I want you to imagine being there. As we read through it, we're going to read through the passage, and then we're going to go over again, but this time with all the context and details. And I want you to identify with the various characters in this story. The uncertainty of Jairus coming to Jesus, the desperation of the woman, Jairus feeling impatient as Jesus tends to the woman instead of his daughter, the woman being outed in front of everybody, the servant, imagine being that servant having to come and tell his master that his daughter's died in front of everyone, the disciples wondering, what the heck's going on here, Jesus? Trying to rush him into his agenda and create the agenda for him, or even just imagine yourself as a member of the crowd watching this whole thing unfurl. So let's read the passage, and then we're going to go into it and go over it again, but this time with all of the context. Okay, so we'll read the passage first. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was speaking, some people from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, came and said, "Your daughter is dead." They said, "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, who was the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mothers and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. So we're going to look through the sandwich and we're going to unpack it as we go. But there is a lot of tie-ins. Each story ties in quite a lot to each other, actually in a way that I fully hadn't realised as I've read this passage, probably like yourself, number of times throughout your life. I hadn't really realised how intricately these stories tie into each other and the message that they're sharing and highlighting. So we're going to go through this again, and we're going to tell the story again, but this time we're going to intercept all the important details and contexts as we go, and hopefully the passage will come alive to you, and God will be speaking to you in different ways as he's been speaking to me. I feel like we're sitting in a sandwich today. That's what we're doing. We're going to unpack it and sit in it. So Jairus is a local synagogue president or a local leader, and his 12-year-old daughter is sick. Now, 12 years old was the age in which girls would begin to get married in that day, and that seems to be quite significant to all the theologians who were reading this. 12 years was also the length of time that this woman had struggled with the issue of blood. So that's your first connection, is that this little girl was the same age that this woman had been struggling with the issue of blood. So Jairus is a synagogue president or leader, and it's not a massively prestigious role in a small town. There was maybe 2 or 3 of these leaders, so significant and important, but not massively important. But it can't have been easy to have Jesus in your local congregation. In some of their eyes, he was creating a problem. He was creating a bit of hustle and bustle, and a lot of Jewish leaders were getting very upset at what Jesus was doing, and it was creating spotlight on all the synagogues that Jesus went to and was creating healing. It was creating spotlights, and synagogue leaders don't like that. They don't want a spotlight on their synagogue. So Jairus was likely to not want to have the spotlight in his hometown, so he was keeping a neutrality on the subject of Jesus. He wasn't for, he wasn't against, but it sounds like he was trying to keep a neutrality. And this was all very well until his baby girl becomes unwell and is likely to die. And what we see is a shift from neutrality to desperation. And so imagine the scenario, an agonizing household where their only daughter is dying. Hope is slipping away like sand through a sieve. So Jairus pockets his pride, he forgets his fears, he puts aside his political controversy. Nothing in this moment is more important than his daughter. Nothing is more important. His job, his reputation, his idea on theology, none of that in this moment matters to Jairus. And he sees Jesus and he throws himself at his feet. How undignified is that? Imagine what they will say about him at next synagogue. Did you see Jairus throwing himself on the mud at the feet of this guy? None of that mattered. Jairus did not care. He was desperate for Jesus. And so he presents his case to Jesus, and Jesus goes with him. So Jesus and Jairus and the crowd are now walking along to Jairus' house. And then in comes our leading lady. She interrupts the proceedings by anonymously touching Jesus' cloak. Not tugging, not hitting Jesus, not touching his flesh, but touching his clothing. And Jesus becomes aware of power leaving him, and he stops. So imagine now this scenario where you have Jairus going, come on, Jesus, come on, come with me. My daughter's just over here. And this woman, or Jesus, just stops in the middle of this crowd and turns his attention. Jairus is probably hopping from foot to foot because of the desperation of his scenario. And Jesus stops. Now, right in this moment, Jesus is between two of the most unclean things in Jewish culture that you can be between. And this is important to understand. In Jewish law, a corpse, a dead body, was one of the most ritually unclean things that you could be near. And blood. So particularly women in their menstrual cycles was particularly unclean, and women had to clean themselves after having their menstrual cycle. So right now, Jesus is literally surrounded by ritual impurity, which in the Jewish law was quite significant. Now this is an important thing to remember. I hadn't fully ever grasped this before. And both of these impurities were the kind that you had to cleanse yourself after being around or touching or being near. So this woman, she has an issue with bleeding, and we assume it's most likely menstrual bleeding that she's had this issue with. Now, she has spent all of her money on trying to get better. To no avail. Absolutely no avail. 12 years, we don't know what kind of money she maybe had before. There were suggestions that she was maybe a woman with money before, but now it sounds like she is a woman without money because she has spent everything that she had. Now, interestingly, there is a preserved record of medicines and treatments applied to women, or treatments that were offered to women like Our Lady here. Would you like to hear them? So this is what our fine lady spent her money on. The treatments that were offered to her was drinking a goblet of wine containing a powder compound from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses. Another was a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine, administered with the summons, "Arise out of your flow of blood." Others included sudden shock or carrying the ash of an ostrich's egg in a certain type of cloth. True story. This is what this lady's preserved records show that this lady had spent her money on. So she had given 12 years all of the money that she had on various different treatment types, trying to be healed. So women in their menstrual cycle were deemed to be unclean, and it meant that they had to go and bathe to be cleaned after their cycle, to be ritually unclean. And this was of utmost importance in Jewish law, and these restrictions and rules absolutely had to be upheld. So being a woman who was now perpetually unclean, imagine what that meant to her in society. She would be without a husband because nobody would touch her. So she would be a single woman on her own, unwell. Now this is a challenge. It's not that she can't talk to people, she can, but she's not allowed to touch them. And it is fairly likely that people would give her a wide berth. It's likely because if they touch her, then they are then unclean, and they have to go through that process of being ritually cleansed. So it's likely that they've given her a wide berth. Now, so all of this to say, you now know the context of this lady and the desperation that she's been in, and she's heard reports of Jesus' healing power. So even within the crowd, people will be touching around her, and they won't know that she's touching her, making her unclean. And she reaches out from behind and she touches his clothing garment. Now, the reason that she touches his garment is because there was likely a commonly held belief that dignity and power were transferred through what a person wore. So this was a mix of kind of magical notion with faith. So it was a bit of a mix of a kind of widespread thinking with kind of magical notions to it. So not really what we would subscribe to in terms of that magical, if I was to touch that, then I would get healed. Now that's separate from what we would believe in faith. But so there was just kind of like this mix. And so she is this unclean woman trying to get clean, and she's bringing magical notions to it. She's bringing desperation to it. She's given 12 years of her life of isolation, all of this coming to this moment. Her perpetual uncleanliness and all of its consequences that I've just explained explains her fear of both openly requesting help and then being discovered after she's received it. So she's terrified of being outed because of what that will mean. She's terrified of being outed. So that's why it's if I just touch his garment, no one will know that I've been here. No one will see me and I can just slip away. But then Jesus realizes power has gone out of him and asks, who touched me? Now, this was a massive theological subject that nobody really wanted to kind of dive into. All the theologians kind of suggest it's a subject for another day, and nobody really touched on it. And so the disciples show up at this moment almost cheeky. And Jesus says, who's touching me? And the disciples say, come on, Jesus, you can see that you're in a crowd. Everyone's touching you. And yet you ask, Jesus, who's touching me? It's imagine like you're in a rugby scrum and you're wondering why you're being touched. Do you imagine the disciples going, really, Jesus? Have you seen everyone's hustling and bustling about you? And you wonder. But the reason that Jesus asks who touched me, because it wasn't a physical touch that he was referring to. There was an intimate connection that happened between Jesus and this woman. That there was a power within him that met the faith or the desperation within Jesus. This desperate woman reaching out, afraid to be seen, caught and noticed, desperate for her miracle, hides and approaches from behind, ashamed but desperate. And Jesus feels that moment. Now, Tom Wright said something amazing about this. If we have the next slide up, he said, when life crowds in with all of its pressures, there is still room for us to creep up behind Jesus. If that's all we feel we can do, and reach out and touch him. In that odd mixture of fear and faith that characterizes so much of Christian discipleship. And I love this because I feel like it sums up this woman where her life is complete chaos. Talk about pressure. And he's saying that there is still room for anybody who feels completely overwhelmed to come up and just to, if that's all you can feel you can do, and that's all she felt she could do. She was desperate. She was ashamed. She was in panic mode, and all she felt she could do was hide and touch the garment of Jesus. Then that is okay. And so she's healed and she knows it. And the question that gets asked in all the books that I've read is, was it her faith that healed her, or was it Jesus' power that healed her? God honored this woman's faith, regardless of her ideas that which bordered on magic. He wasn't offended. Jesus didn't go, oh, you came to me with magical notions, therefore I'm not going to heal you. He wasn't offended by that. He saw her desperation. He saw her faith. Of course, we know that it was God's power that healed Jesus, that healed the woman. It was God's power that healed the woman. But Jesus tells her, daughter, it was your faith that healed you. And this got me asking, was it faith or was it desperation? Honestly, I think that there is a very fine line between faith and fear sometimes. You imagine this woman in complete desperation mode, and Jesus says to her, your faith has made you well. Your faith has healed you. I think there's a very fine line between fear and faith and desperation and hope. And I don't think any of that matters to Jesus. I think he just wanted her to come. I think he just wanted her to come and touch his garment. I don't think he minded that she came with magical notions. I don't think that he minded that she came impure. I don't think he minded that she hid herself. I don't think he minded that she wanted to remain anonymous. I just think he wanted her to come. So imagine, still in the story, this has just happened, and you can imagine the crowd. Just imagine yourself there watching on, and Jairus is still there hopping from foot to foot. An impure woman in the midst of the crowd, touching everyone, has just interrupted Jesus, has been outed and healed in front of everyone. Can you imagine the crowd? Oh no, I've now got to go and wash. There was an impure woman bustling against me, and she's now just been outed. But Jairus is here, and Jesus is technically now unclean, and he's about to go to a dead body. And you can imagine the height of tension and suspense in this moment. And you think it can't get any higher. The crowd are watching with their popcorn, maybe a sandwich. And the suspense is high, and in walks a servant and says, Jairus, I wouldn't want to be that servant. There's no point. Leave the master. Your daughter is now dead. Could you imagine being Jairus in that moment? You've tried really hard to be patient as Jesus has given a miracle to another person. And in that moment, your daughter died. That's a pretty tall order for Jesus, who then turns around, a pretty tall order from Jesus to then turn around to Jairus and say, it's all right, Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid. Imagine yourself right now in this moment. You've just been told your daughter is dead. Jesus has turned to you and says, don't be afraid, just believe. Imagine yourself being Jairus, over your head in grief, pain, and uncertainty. Jesus has told you not to be afraid and to just believe. How do you respond? So then Jairus walks with Jesus now to where his home is, to where his daughter is. And you would have known that they were approaching his house because of the noise. So you wouldn't have been like, oh, here we are. Didn't realize this was my house here. You would have known that you were approaching from blocks away because of the wailing. So they hired professional mourners whenever somebody died. And this is people who come to the house and they wail. And they play the flute, and they weep, and they make a really loud noise in the house. And I always thought this was really odd. I always never really understood what this was about. But my understanding of it is that this is surprisingly healthy. Surprisingly. Because the reason that they hire people to come and make noise of mourning and weeping and wailing in a house is to cover the grief and the wailing of those who are in the house grieving. It's to provide a covering for those who are really grieving, to let their emotion out in a way that they won't be embarrassed, in a way that they won't be seen. This has really got very little to do with the point that I'm wanting to make, but I couldn't skip over it because it resonated within me, and there's so much I felt like I could say about this. The importance of letting our grief out. You know, Jairus and that household in deep in grief, the importance of letting your grief out, the importance of being real with your emotions. And what we see in this moment is having people to cover your pain as you process. Because that's what that is. That is people who were paid, doesn't matter, but people who were paid to come in to cover their pain so that they could be as real and ugly in their grief and pain as they needed to be. You know, Western culture, we're told to bottle it in, aren't we? Like, do you know, like our girls love this program, and it's this guy crying and he tells his tear to suck back in again. He goes, get back in there, tear. And he's like this big manly macho, like, I will not cry. And it's like that in this culture sometimes, isn't it? Like, keep it in. When actually there's something far healthier, and that is letting our grief out and being real with it. Anyway, Jesus turns to the professional mourners and he's like, out, get out. And they laugh at him. And he says, okay, well, only 3 of my disciples are allowed in with me, so Peter, James, and John. And so there's 6 people in total who see this miracle. There's the 3 disciples, there's Jesus, and then there's the mother and father. And this time, it's Jesus' turn to reach out and touch the woman, to touch the girl. So the woman reached out and touched him, but this time it's Jesus' turn. And he reaches out and he touches the girl, and he gives the command, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Now, why did this phrase remain untranslated? Everything else was in Aramaic, and everything else was translated to the different languages that we read our Bibles in. Why not this phrase? It's a bit like Abba, Father. Why not that phrase? They're not magic phrases. It's not like Jesus reached out and said abracadabra. How weird would that be? These are ordinary words used to waken a sleeping child. This would be normal part of language. Like when I get up in the morning, I say, honey, time to get up. Usually they're saying to me, mummy, time to get up. They were ordinary words spoken to a sleeping child. And the conclusion that was come to through different theologians is because this is God breaking into and working through the ordinary details of life. This is God using the ordinary details of life. Because they say that actually the disciples would have been telling this story. And then Jesus said, Talitha cum. This ordinary phrase, wake up, sleeping child. Like this ordinary phrase, Abba, Father, which just means daddy. These ordinary phrases that Jesus used, God breaking into and working through the ordinary details of life. I mean, I'm emotionally exhausted now. I mean, that's an intense passage. That is a passage full of desperate people. Both of these stories about desperate people, both of these stories are about Jesus removing what made them unclean. I mean, we don't really get that in this culture because we don't really see things as unclean like that. But to them, they were kind of terrified of stuff like that. It meant that they couldn't, approach synagogue. It meant that they couldn't integrate into daily life when they were unclean. Like it was a big thing to them. Both stories are about Jesus meeting people right where they were at. Whether that was a synagogue leader or whether that was an isolated and fearful woman, he met both, a man, a woman, of standing, of no standing, both with uncleanliness. He met them both. But both stories are about fear and faith. And both stories are about the power of Jesus to take whoever they are from a place of fear into faith. Both those stories took those people from fear into faith. And I've mused and processed this passage over the week, and 2 things stood out to me. The first one is Jesus is not afraid of our impurity or our uncleanness, or our sin, as we might call it. He's not afraid of being associated with us. He's not afraid of being associated with what makes us unclean. He's not afraid of your sin. He wasn't afraid of the woman with the issue of blood, and he wasn't afraid of a dead body. The woman grabbed at Jesus in the midst of her chaos, and Jairus fell at his feet in the midst of his pain. Absolute desperation. Both of them in absolute desperation, both grabbing at Jesus in different ways. And if we have that passage back up, that quote from Tom Wright, when the crowd gathers in with all its pressures, there is still room for us to creep up behind Jesus. If that's all we feel we can do, and reach out and touch him, in that odd mixture of fear and faith that characterizes so much of Christian discipleship. And there is a very important message for us in this. It doesn't matter how you come to Jesus. He's not afraid of your sin. He's not afraid of how you are. He's not afraid of what might make you unclean. He just wants you to come, and if all you can do is fall at his feet and touch the hem of his garment, then that's all you can do, and that's all Jesus wants you to do. And the other thing that stood out to me is our own uncleanliness. Oh, hang on, I've got this bit wrong. So the two things that stood out to me were Jesus isn't afraid of our impurity and our own uncleanliness. If there's anyone who can clean the most stubborn of stains, it's Jesus. If there's anyone who can see a stain and deal with it, it's Jesus. You know, I've ministered to so many people who've been reluctant to come to ministry in the past because they say things like, if you knew the truth about me, you wouldn't want to pray for me. You might not want to be seen with me because I have a reputation, or I've done too much wrong, even for Jesus. But what this passage speaks so loudly and so clearly to is that Jesus doesn't care what people think about him being associated with or who. He never cared. He ate and drank with the people that he wasn't supposed to eat and drink with. He doesn't care who he's associated with. He cares about the person. Two of the most impure associations in one scenario, and he met them there, and he meets us in our moments as well. So that was the two things that stood out, was our own uncleanliness and chaos. Our own uncleanliness and chaos. I like what Tom Wright says about coming to Jesus in the midst of our chaos. Because sometimes if we think that we can come to Jesus only when our ducks are in a row and when everything's in order, well, if you're anything like me, then not sure I'm going to get there. Not sure I'm ever going to get my ducks in a row. Don't think I'm ever going to feel like I've made the mark. Google sometimes tells me that I've arrived at my destination and says, Joe, you have arrived. And I say, oh, Google, I haven't. I definitely have not arrived. The truth is, Jesus doesn't want us to feel like we have to get there. There is so much intimacy in these moments of mess and pain. There is a pain, there's an authenticity in these moments. There is something so powerful. There's an intimacy in these painful, messy moments that you can't have in any other moment. When you're desperate and somebody shows you kindness, there is something so powerful in that moment that can't be replaced whenever somebody's kind to you because you have it all together. When all you can say is help. When you're not sure if it's faith or just downright desperation, help is enough. Jairus, I'm scared of losing my baby girl. Woman, help. I have no one else to turn to, nowhere else to go, and I have nothing left to give. Help. There is an intimacy in these painful moments that can't be given in any other way. And I think all Jesus wants for us to do is sometimes either fall at his feet or creep up behind him and just say, help. You know, I've had times of pain. And you know this, I'm very honest with you guys. I've had times of pain, and sometimes it's been a pain so deep that all I have been able to say is help. Seasons where I couldn't tell you if my prayers were actual desperation or if they were faith or fear or a bit of them all. I couldn't tell you. Sometimes I've just vented. And Neil's gone, why don't you turn that to a prayer? And I've gone, amen. No word of a lie. I vent, and Neil goes, why don't you pray about that? And I go, amen. I'm so angry. I'm so hurt. I'm so sore. Amen. But sometimes I think that faith is just holding on long enough, isn't it? It's just holding on long enough. Sometimes by your fingernails, reaching out and grabbing at his cloak, falling at his feet, and all of these things are okay. Because all these things led to Jesus, and it's the coming to Jesus that he wants. He wants us to come to him. And I think we can all relate to someone in our Mark and Sandwich today. A desperate person coming to Jesus, either the woman or Jairus. Jairus watching the healing of the woman while waiting for his own miracle, wondering when will it be his turn to see a miracle. The woman being touched by Jesus and given new life. The disciples watching on in complete confusion. And I think there's a part of each of our story in all of these people. And I think that's what I love about this story, is there's something in all of those characters in us. And I want to get over today another way of what I said 2 weeks ago. And it is just come. Just come to Jesus as you are. Just come as you are. Jesus is not afraid of you. He is not afraid. So bring your impurity and your sin, bring your pain, bring your desperation, bring your different ideas on theology, healing, magic, whatever that might be. Bring your uncertainty, because he is the one who heals, restores, renews. He's the one who gives life where there has been loss and pain and hardship. He is not afraid of being associated with you. And I think this last thing that I've said is really important, and it's stuck with me all week, because I feel that there's people here who think that Jesus doesn't want to be associated with them. Jesus is not afraid to be associated with you. Just come as you are, even if you feel like you're holding on by your fingernails. Just come as you are. I've had seasons where I felt like I've been holding on to my fingernails, and I've just held on. But just come as you are. We see the kindness and boldness of Jesus in our sandwich today. A Jesus who leans in when we're struggling and we feel pain, and a Jesus who stops for us, and a Jesus who heals us. But a Jesus who just says, come as you are. So just come as you are. We're going to have healing at the end. If Neil and the band are able to come up, we're going to have our last song. But we're going to have some healing at the end again today, just up at the back. So if Peter, Vivian, Neil, Rob, Jodie, name blank. Sorry, Jodie. Are able to pray, then we're just going to have some prayer at the back. And we're going to have prayer for physical, emotional, spiritual healing. Whatever pain it is that you feel like you're carrying, we want to see it healed. If you feel like people shouldn't be associated with you, we want to see that broken off, because that's not true. That is not true. If you feel like you're always seeing other people get their miracle, like Jairus standing watching another woman be healed while his daughter died, that's a hard thing to watch. And if you feel like you've watched other people get their miracle and you haven't had yours, then I want you to come and we want to pray for you. If you're feeling desperate, let us come and pray for you. If you're feeling confused, just come and we want to pray for you. But whatever you do, we just come to Jesus, however you are today. And we're going to go back into this last song. And will you just come to Jesus as you are? And just come and let him heal you. And just come and let him minister to you. So I'm going to pray and we're going to go straight into our last song. So Father God, I just thank you that you are a kind and gracious Jesus. That you let us come to you exactly as we are, in desperation, in pain, in confusion, in anger, in faith, in fear, in a mixture of everything, God, that you just want us to come. Whether the chaos of life just feels so pressurized and so much that all we want to do is hide, God, I pray that you would help us to reach out and to touch you, even when we just want to hide. Would we just reach out a hand with enough desperation and faith and just touch you, Jesus? And that you would meet us in that intimate moment that only can happen between us and you. God, whether we feel like we want to fall at your feet or whether we just want to rest in your presence and let your love be lavished over us, God, we just come to you this morning because you are good and you are kind and you heal us. And you heal us by your power and you meet us in an intimate moment with your kindness. And so we come to you as we are, ready to be accepted and loved and healed as we are. Let's worship.